Over, so you were
You can start whenever.
Okay. So, welcome. Welcome to the world of Airbus Airliners. We're going to talk about how Airbus got going and a little bit about the why and the how it got to be where it is today, which is making about half of the world's airliners. My name's David. I'm not going to trouble you with my more complicated surname. So David it is. And we're just going to take a look at how things got going. And the best way to understand Airbus and how it got going is to go back to the start of the jet age, have a quick look at how some of the early jets got going, and then we'll get into Airbus itself, and we'll go through until the early days of the A300, which was the first Airbus aircraft. So let's go back to the start of the jet age, which was the de Havilland Comet. This is an aircraft that had a lot of accidents. I guess many of you know about that, so I'm not going to go into that. And as a result, although it was the very first jetliner, huge leap forward compared to the propeller aircraft of the time, because of the accidents, it never really sold that well. 114 sold. First flight was in July 1949. The reason this aircraft is here will become clear in a moment. It's an Armagnac. It was an aircraft made in Toulouse in France. It was intended to carry about 80 passengers and fly transatlantic routes, but it never delivered on its range, and only 9 were built. And the reason is that it's here is that in June 1950, in June 1950, the aircraft took off on a test flight from Toulouse, and it crashed. And of the people on board, 2 were killed. 1 person was killed on the ground. But this guy was one of the guys on board, and he survived. Anybody know who he is? I will explain as we go through. So the next jet after the Comet was the Caravelle. This did quite successfully, particularly so compared to European standards. 282 sold. It was the first jet aimed at short to medium haul routes, and it was the first with rear engines. And remember that guy who survived the accident? Well, he was in charge of flight test for the Caravelle. Moving forward, next European jetliner was the Sidley Aviation Trident, made by the same people that made the Comet, because de Havilland got absorbed into Sidley Aviation. With this aircraft, the main customer, British European Airways, government owned, and the government told BEA, you have to buy the Trident. Nobody likes to be told what to do. And the airline said, well, if I have to buy it, I want it like this. I want this number of passengers, that range, and then I'll buy it. So against its better judgment, Sidley made the aircraft to suit this one particular airline's requirements, and that was a smaller aircraft than the market really needed. So basically, the airline and the manufacturer screwed each other. The aircraft never really sold that well, 117 sold. This aircraft competed with the Boeing 727, which, as you probably know, sold 1,800 and something aircraft. The next British jetliner, the VC-10, lovely looking aeroplane, I always think, maybe you too. And it was a similar story. British Overseas Airways Corporation, government owned, told it had to buy the British aircraft, said, if I have to buy it, I want it like that. But this time there was an additional requirement because BOAC served destinations that used to be part of the British Empire, places like Singapore, Johannesburg, Nairobi. Now all those places are difficult for an aircraft because they're either very hot, like Singapore, very close to the equator, or worse still, they're hot and high, like Nairobi, it's a mile high, Johannesburg is a mile high. So BOAC had to make an aircraft that could fly out of those airports. And that's the reason it has 4 engines at the back, leaves a nice clean wing onto which you can have nice big slats and flaps, give you a lot of lift for takeoff. But it brought a weight penalty. The competing aircraft, Boeing 707, never had to meet that requirement. Again, limited success, only 54 sold. It was a very popular aircraft with passengers. They loved the cabin, very quiet because the engines were at the back, but just never sold that well. This is the next aircraft, British Aircraft Corporation 111. This appealed to a broader market, did rather better, sold 244. BEA was the customer, and they did manage to affect the aircraft a little bit later in its life when BAC was thinking of doing a stretched version. BEA took a long time to decide what they wanted. That delayed the aircraft, hampered sales a little bit. So that's the background. We're coming towards the Airbus saga now. That was the background against which Airbus started to get formed. And as you can see, this is the sales to the end of 1969. Compared to the US manufacturers, the British jets were just not selling well. So the Europeans realized that something needed to be done, but what? This gentleman, the head of Sud Aviation, which is a company in Toulouse, which made the Caravelle, he realized that a country like France, Sud Aviation was French, didn't have the resources to compete against the Americans. And as he says here, that was that which made him think that it had to be European. Remember our crash survivor? This is his take on working in Europe. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but essentially he's saying if you remove barriers between people, in this case national barriers, barriers between the countries in Europe, then people are more able to work together and understand each other. So what was happening was that various aerospace companies in Europe were thinking about what aircraft to do next. And this is a couple of the designs. The one in the bottom was produced by Sud Aviation, called the Galion. And the one at the top, a grouping of 3 companies, Hawk City Aviation, Breguet, and Nord Aviation, came up with the HP 100. And these various different studies evolved over time into what would become Airbus's first aircraft, which was the A300, A for Airbus, and 300 because it was originally going to have 300 seats. However, things never quite go according to plan, and things would turn out rather differently. So what we had was single-aisle aircraft such as the Boeing 707, the DC-8, at the bottom end of the market with something like 150 seats. And US manufacturers Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were already working on what would become the first wide-body aircraft, the first aircraft with 2 aisles in the cabin. And so there was quite a big gap in the market. Now, Airbus knew, or the companies that were going to become Airbus knew, that if they went head-to-head against Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, it would be suicidal. And in fact, when Airbus salesmen and saleswomen went knocking on the doors of the airlines, the usual response they got was, "We already have 3 suppliers. Why do we need another one?" So Airbus had to offer something innovative and different just to be listened to. Now, you may be thinking that the A300, it's not really in the middle of that market gap, and you'd be right. It is quite close in size to the TriStar and the DC-10. However, the A300 is much less in range than the TriStar and the DC-10, so it's a little bit more in the middle of that gap than might appear from just looking at the seating alone. So in 1967, work begins more seriously on the A300. And our crash survivor, his name is Roger Bethe, is in charge of technical development and coordinating the program. Now, the smart ones among you may have noticed that in the earlier picture that you saw of him, he was wearing a white tie. And he's wearing a white tie here too. And if anybody asked him why he was wearing the white tie, he would say, "It's so I don't have to think about what to dress like in the morning." But the reality was that he'd lost a daughter, and the white tie was his way of remembering her. And that's an inspiration for all of us, because we tend to think that the leaders of companies got where they are because they had good opportunities, and that's why they got to where they are. The reality, as in the case of Bethe, is that often they have overcome big obstacles. Another example is the guy that succeeded Roger Bethe, John Pierson. He never knew his father. His father died when he was very young, but he still went on to lead Airbus in the mid-80s. Another example, Neil Armstrong, a name familiar to you. He too lost a daughter, and he had his house burned down, but he still went on to be the first guy to walk on the moon. Mid to late 60s, thank you. Setbacks begin to mount. The market starts saying that it wants an aircraft a bit smaller than 300 seats. And an even bigger setback is the engine that Airbus had planned to use, going to be developed by Rolls-Royce, called the RB207. Well, Rolls-Royce decides we're not going to do the engine. So Airbus, Roger Bethe's team, they shrink the aircraft. Now that the aircraft is smaller, less heavy, they can manage with one of the existing engines that's being developed for the US wide bodies, the Lockheed, the Douglas, and the Boeing. Airbus chooses the CF6-50 from General Electric, and that also saves it a lot in development costs. And that's something we can take away too, because very often in life, things don't go the way that you expected. There are setbacks. And instead of bemoaning the setback, if we can try to turn it to our advantage, in America you'd say turn a knock, then sometimes, more often than you might think, you can actually turn a setback to your advantage. And that's kind of what Airbus managed to do. In shrinking the aircraft, we also came to a different fuselage cross-section. Now you may be thinking, cross-section of the fuselage, kid stuff, right? It's not so difficult, you need a certain number of passengers. It's actually something that's very important in design of an airliner, because you can't change it later without great difficulty. Some of you may be familiar with Boeing and the 367-80. That was Boeing's first jet. They made that originally as a fiber-breast fuselage. When it came to do the KC-135 tanker, the US Air Force wanted it 12 inches wider. So they made the fuselage 12 inches wider. And then when it came to do the airliner version, to have a proper 6 abreast layout, Boeing needed to add another 4 inches. So the fuselage cross-section went through 3 different sizes at great cost and great time. So the fuselage of the A300, and again it's our crash survivor who had a big hand in this. You remember that he had been head of flight test for the Caravelle, and during his time on the Caravelle he'd found that for many airlines the Caravelle suffered from a lack of underfloor baggage space, cargo and passenger baggage space. So when it came to doing the A300, he made sure that there would be plenty of space for cargo. And in fact, he ensured, he and his team, that it could take the kind of cargo containers, baggage containers, called LD3s, which were being developed also for the US wide bodies, the TriStar, the DC-10, and the 747. This is a little bit complicated, but don't worry. The only message with this chart is when things are changing, it's hard to manage. Now, we're a European company, or Airbus is a European company, and at the beginning, the governments agreed to back their respective industries in doing this new project. You may be thinking that's a curiously European thing, and maybe not really fair from a business point of view, but the reality is that there is government support on both sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, it mainly takes the form of repayable loans, so money the governments loan to the aerospace industries, which they then have to pay back as a levy on sales. In America, it tends to be things like large NASA research contracts, military research contracts, and tax breaks. Government support, provided it's balanced, is a good thing for us as travellers because it helps us to have the ability to travel at an affordable price. The message here is simply that in addition to having to deal with the loss of the planned engine, to shrink the aircraft, Airbus also had to deal with this changing government situation. And it evolves even more over time. I've shaded it out because that's further into the future. But essentially, the three main countries, despite this government toing and froing, this government wavering, they agreed that they would continue slightly different work shares, with Hawker Siddeley staying as the company that was making the wings for the aircraft, Hawker Siddeley Aviation, HSA, but as a subcontractor that was investing some of its own money. So we're now in 1969, and this aircraft has made its first flight. This is actually the British first flight. There was a French one a little bit earlier. And 1969, kind of at the end of the 70s, was a very special year in aerospace and airliner terms. One of the reasons is that the A300 got launched, but there were also several other milestones, as you see here. 1969 saw the first flight of Boeing 747. It saw the first flight of Concorde. It saw the manned landing on the moon, the first manned landing on the moon, and of course the launch of the A300. So we're at the end of the 60s. Let's just pause for a moment and have a quick look at what's been happening. I've been talking about what's been happening in Europe, but as you can see, a lot's been happening in America too. Boeing's been getting going with several different aircraft programs, Douglas, also, and Convair to some extent in the middle. And the wide bodies are coming. So it's against this sort of context, this kind of background, that Airbus is really getting going. Now, Concorde, at the time, hard for us to believe today, but it was going to be the big thing of the future. Supersonic travel was going to be what everybody did. And subsonic aircraft were going to be relegated to carrying cargo. Didn't turn out like that. Concorde did a great job at what it did, but as we know, supersonic travel never really took off. But Concorde did great things for Airbus, because it taught us a lot of lessons. And I probably would not be standing in front of you today talking about Airbus if Concorde had not happened before Airbus. One of the lessons was it makes no sense to duplicate production, especially if it's for a very small number of aircraft. So Concorde, 20 aircraft were made, and they had 2 assembly lines, one in Toulouse in France, one in Bristol in the UK, to make 20 aircraft, 10 built in each site. Absolutely crazy. So when it came to Airbus, we are not having a lot of costly duplication. There are also positive lessons. This is a little bit technical, but Concorde, supersonic, when you go supersonic, where the lift acts on the wing changes. And the way on Concorde that you counterbalance that was to pump fuel from a tank at the front of the aircraft to a tank at the back. You'd make that fuel transfer when you went supersonic, and then you'd make it in reverse when you came subsonic. When we did Airbus, and in particular a derivative of the A300, the A310-300, we used that same principle, but for a different reason. This time, it was to balance the aircraft using a change in centre of gravity rather than by deflecting an aerodynamic surface, which would have caused drag and extra fuel burn. So, a lot of lessons that we learned from Concorde, some positive, like the transfer of fuel, some negative, like the way you manufactured the aircraft. Another thing that came out of Concorde was the role of governments in the program. Because of Concorde, when Airbus came along, the governments acted in a more supportive role rather than in one in which they were heavily involved, some would even say interfering, in the industrial way of the company. So they were being collaborative rather than being nationalistic. We've seen that the A300 was launched. It was actually launched before the company Airbus was formed, which happened in 1970. And as I hope you can see here, our logo, including one 3-hour one-on-one between Frank Borman and our crash survivor, Roger Bertain. They were there with the team, their teams left them, and for 3 hours they talked, and after it, Eastern committed to leasing some aircraft. Now, Eastern was having some struggles at the time, and Airbus made a very bold move. It would lease, free of charge, 4 A300s to Eastern for 6 months. It did. Eastern was very happy with the result and went on to buy a lot of Airbus aircraft. Eastern had been the first to fly the L1011 TriStar, and it found that the A300 was about 20% more efficient than the TriStar. So that kind of validates the decision to go for 2 engines. Perhaps one of the reasons that Douglas and Boeing went for 3 engines was because 2 engines were not allowed to fly more than an hour away from a suitable airport, which kind of limited overwater operations. But Airbus took the decision to go for a twin, and it was that innovation which led to it succeeding in the marketplace. Without that, we probably wouldn't be here. So we've pretty much come to the end of our little talk today about how Airbus got going and why. Let's end it with a tribute. A tribute to Apollo and the men and women who worked on that program. Frank Borman actually led a crew that included Jim Lovell. He was the commander on Apollo 13, which, as you may know, had an explosion in flight. But also Bill Anders, and Bill Anders died earlier this month. He was part of the crew, and you're seeing that picture, Earthrise. It's called one of the most famous pictures in the world. You've all seen it, right? And he was the one that took the picture.